the late summer of 1895, when the Ozark Mountains still swallowed men whole, locals whispered of a family who had never once lost a hunt, a fight, or a wager. They were called the Crows, a name spoken only after dark and only in a whisper. Their patriarch, Elias Crow, was said to have made a pact with something buried deep beneath the mountain, a thing that promised him and his bloodline eternal victory, if they paid in flesh. It began, they said, with one child, his own daughter, offered to the earth under a blood-red moon. By dawn, Elias returned from the woods with eyes that no longer looked human and a smile that never left his face again. For years, the family prospered while others starved. Their crops never failed, their hunts never missed, and their enemies seemed to disappear without a trace. The townspeople grew suspicious, then terrified. Rumors spread that each harvest season, the Crows held a gathering no outsider was ever allowed to witness. On those nights, strange lights flickered from their property, and the air carried the sound of children crying, not in pain, but in chant. Those who lived closest to the Crow homestead swore the family no longer aged like normal people. The eldest son, who should have been well into his 50s, still looked no older than 25. The daughters spoke in soft, unbroken tones, their voices always overlapping as though they shared one mind. Animals avoided the area completely, and even the wind refused to blow across their fields. One winter, a hunter from a nearby town vanished after boasting he would kill a crow deer for sport. When his body was found weeks later, his eyes were missing, and his mouth had been sewn shut with coarse animal sinew. Near him, carved into a tree, were the words, "The mountain keeps what is owed." As decades passed, the Crow legend turned to silence. The family withdrew even further, their home buried in overgrown brush and fog thick enough to choke the breath from your throat. But when the first search party finally reached the cabin in the early 1900s, they discovered something no superstition could explain. The windows were sealed with tar. The walls were covered in symbols of blood and ash, and in the center of the room, an altar, built from human bones, with a single jar placed upon it, filled with what looked like a heart that was still beating. Locals say the ground still trembles near where the Crow house once stood, especially on harvest nights. They say if you press your ear to the soil, you can hear the muffled sound of crying children, and the faint whisper of a man's voice, counting the debts of his bloodline, waiting for the next offering to be made. In 1895, the Ozark Mountains stood as one of the last frontiers of true wilderness in America, a place untouched by civilization, where silence itself felt alive and the forests seemed to breathe with their own hidden pulse. The locals called it cursed land, not just for the strange sounds that echoed from the valleys after midnight, but for the family that lived deep within its shadowed heart, the Crows. They were unlike any other settlers, keeping to themselves, rarely visiting nearby towns, and when they did, their pale faces and glassy eyes made people turn away. No one knew where they came from, and no one dared to ask. The only thing people knew for certain was that the Crows had never once suffered misfortune. Their crops grew tall even in drought, their livestock never sickened, and they always won, whether in trade, gambling, or even petty disputes. It was as though fate itself bent around them, ensuring their triumph in every endeavor. But victory came with whispers, rumors that their success was not of hard work or luck, but of something far older and darker. Elias Crow, the patriarch, had once been a soldier in the Civil War. Those who remembered him said he came back from battle a changed man, haunted, silent, and obsessed with Scripture. He preached about purity and sacrifice, about blood being the key to redemption, and built a small chapel beside his cabin where only his family was allowed to worship. It was said that during a harsh winter, when food ran out and disease spread through the valley, Elias disappeared into the forest for 7 days. When he returned, his eyes were wild, his beard matted with dirt and dried blood. He claimed he had met a spirit, something older than God, that lived within the mountains and promised eternal victory to his family if they offered a bloodline untainted by outsiders. He called it the Covenant of the Mountain. No one believed him at first, but when every other family in the valley began to lose livestock, fall ill, or vanish into the snow, the Crows alone remained untouched. It was then the townsfolk realized Elias might not be mad after all. As time passed, the Crow family grew wealthier and eerily untouched by aging. Their children looked the same for decades, their skin pale and luminous under the moonlight. Some said it was the mountain's gift, others called it its curse. But what struck fear into everyone's heart was the strange light that glowed above the Crow property each autumn, the night of the harvest moon. The light wasn't fire or lanterns. It pulsed like something breathing, flickering deep within the trees. Those brave enough to watch from afar swore they heard chanting, the sound of many voices speaking as one, followed by a sharp cry that echoed through the valley. By dawn, the light would vanish, and Elias would appear in town days later with sacks full of gold dust, animal pelts, and strange carved relics that no one could identify. The legend of the Crow Pact began to take root. Hunters avoided their land. Children were warned never to follow the trails that led toward their homestead. And preachers spoke of the family as living proof of man's arrogance against God. But Elias didn't stop. He believed the mountain had chosen his family for greatness, that their isolation and purity made them worthy of its blessings. The family stopped marrying outsiders, stopped mingling with other settlers, and began to intermarry among themselves to preserve the sacred blood. What began as religious devotion turned into something monstrous. Each generation was born paler, quieter, and more strange. Their limbs seemed too long, their eyes reflecting light like animals. Some villagers said they'd seen crow children crawling through the fields at night, whispering to the soil as if answering an unseen voice. By the early 1900s, the family had become myth, their home a forbidden place marked on no map. Those who wandered too close to their land were said to vanish without a trace, their belongings later found arranged in neat circles near the tree line. It was as though the mountain itself had claimed them. A few locals still whispered that they heard Elias's sermons echoing through the trees, words about eternal victory, blood sacrifice, and the mountain's promise. And whenever tragedy struck the neighboring towns, a flood, a fire, or a sickness, it was said that somewhere, high in the Ozark mist, the Crows celebrated another year of survival, untouched and undefeated. But not all who lived near them believed they were human anymore. Some hunters spoke of seeing figures moving through the woods on all fours, their limbs bending in ways no human bones should allow. Others claimed that the mountain around the Crow property had begun to change, the soil turning black, the trees twisting toward the house as if drawn by some unseen force. Even animals avoided the area. Birds flew around it, never over it. Dogs refused to bark in that direction. And yet, sometimes, on the coldest nights, people swore they could hear faint laughter coming from deep within the forest, high-pitched, childlike, and echoing long after the wind had died. Elias Crow's descendants continued his rituals, each generation bound by the pact made in 1895. They believed the mountain's spirit demanded purity, demanded blood unbroken by outsiders, and in return, it gave them power beyond understanding. Their fortune, their health, their unnatural longevity, it all came at a price. And though the Crows became little more than legend, some say that deep in the Ozarks, where the trees grow too close together and the air feels too heavy to breathe, their descendants still live, guarding the same mountain, keeping the same covenant, and waiting for the next harvest moon when the earth will once again demand its due. The story of the Crows did not fade with time. It only grew more disturbing as whispers of their rituals spread beyond the valleys. By the early 1900s, people in nearby settlements began to notice something that sent chills down their spines. The Crows never left their land, yet every year their wealth increased. Their livestock multiplied even when the region suffered drought, and while other farms were devastated by disease, the Crows' animals remained strong and fertile. Elias Crow, who should have been an old man by then, was still seen wandering the forest at night, carrying a lantern that glowed with an eerie, pulsating light. He looked unchanged, his back straight, his hair thick and dark, his eyes glimmering as if he saw something others couldn't. Some thought it was witchcraft. Others believed he had struck a deal not with the devil, but with something far older that dwelled deep within the Ozark soil. Locals began to avoid the roads leading into the mountains, especially after dark. Those few who dared to venture close to the Crow property claimed to hear strange noises echoing from the hills, chanting, guttural sounds, and the rhythmic beating of drums. The sound would rise with the wind and then vanish just as quickly, leaving behind a silence that felt alive. The pattern always occurred during the same week each year, just before the harvest moon. Superstition spread like wildfire. Farmers swore that if you looked toward the crowland during that week, you could see red light flickering through the trees, moving like veins beneath the earth. One traveler passing through the Ozarks in 1908 described seeing figures gathered around a stone circle, their bodies painted with mud, their heads bowed as they moved in unison. When he tried to approach, he said he heard a low humming from the ground itself, and the air grew so thick he could hardly breathe. Terrified, he fled the valley and never returned. By then, most locals treated the Crow family as ghosts, an unspoken reminder of what happens when man crosses into forbidden territory. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, and it wasn't long before outsiders tried to uncover the truth. In 1912, a group of state officials arrived, claiming to be investigating reports of illegal distilleries hidden in the mountains. They never found any moonshine, but they returned with strange stories. One officer said the forest near the Crow homestead seemed to warp as they entered, the trees bending inward as if closing behind them. The group found animal bones arranged in precise spirals, symbols carved into stones, and a pit filled with a dark, tar-like substance that smelled of iron. When they reached the Crow cabin, it was empty, no voices, no signs of life, but food still sat on the table, untouched and warm, as if someone had just eaten. One of the men swore he heard whispers behind him the entire time, faint voices speaking a language he couldn't understand. Weeks after their investigation, all three officers resigned without explanation. One of them, in his later years, told a journalist that something in those woods looked back at him, that he could still feel its gaze decades later. His hair turned white within a month of returning from the Ozarks. That story was buried, dismissed as mountain folklore, but locals knew better. They said the Crows had become something else. Entirely, something beyond human comprehension. Elias Crow's descendants continued the rituals long after he vanished into the forest one winter and never returned. His eldest son, Silas Crow, took his place as patriarch. Unlike his father, Silas rarely appeared in daylight. He was said to have skin so pale it seemed translucent, with veins that shimmered blue beneath. Those few who caught sight of him described him as tall and thin, with eyes that glowed faintly amber in darkness. Silas claimed the mountain had spoken to him, that it had chosen him as the new keeper of the Pact. He reinforced the family's isolation, forbidding anyone from leaving or marrying outsiders. It was said that each birth in the Crow family was followed by a night of ritual, a celebration and sacrifice intertwined. One winter, a violent snowstorm buried much of the region, cutting off the mountain roads for weeks. When it finally cleared, a search party found something horrifying. At the base of the Crow property, 3 wooden crosses stood in the snow. On them were hung the remains of wild animals, foxes, deer, and birds, skinned and arranged in intricate patterns. In the center, carved into the frozen ground, were words written in blood. "The mountain provides." From that point on, no one dared to approach again. Over the next few decades, rumors persisted of strange lights glowing above the mountain, of eerie music that seemed to come from underground, and of inhuman figures glimpsed between the trees. Locals spoke of children born deformed in nearby towns whenever the Crow rituals occurred, as if the curse radiated outward from their land. A preacher once tried to bless the area, sprinkling holy water at the forest's edge, but within days his church burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances. People began to believe that the Crow's covenant had fused with the land itself, that their blood had seeped into the mountain and awakened something ancient that now fed through them. The most disturbing part of the legend, however, came from a hunter who stumbled upon a collapsed section of the Crow property in the 1930s. Beneath the soil, he claimed, were tunnels, miles of them, filled with bones, relics, and walls carved with scenes of worship. The carvings showed a towering figure rising from the mountain, surrounded by human forms bowing before it. The creature had no face, only a hollow void where eyes should be. The hunter fled in terror, and when he tried to bring others to see it, The tunnels had sealed overnight as though the earth had swallowed them whole. To this day, no trace of those tunnels has ever been found. The Crows became a ghost story, their land reclaimed by nature, their name erased from county records. Yet those who live near the Ozark foothills still swear that when the harvest moon rises and the wind blows down from the peaks, you can hear faint chanting beneath the earth, a reminder that some victories come at a price far greater than anyone dares to pay. The years that followed the Crow family's isolation brought an unsettling transformation that even the most skeptical could not ignore. The once rugged and broad-shouldered men of the clan grew thin and long-limbed, their skin losing its warmth and turning a pallid, almost translucent shade that gleamed like wax under the moonlight. Their eyes, once brown or green, shifted to a pale, milky color that reflected light like a cat's, eyes that seemed to shimmer unnaturally in darkness. Some who caught glimpses of them from afar said it was as if they had stopped being human, as if the blood pact Elias Crow had made with the mountain was now carving its mark into their very flesh. They moved differently too, slow and deliberate, with a kind of grace that made even the smallest motion feel unnatural. The children, born into this new generation, spoke little and often together, repeating the same phrases in eerie unison, as though their minds were bound by something unseen. Farmers who lived miles away from the Crow property began reporting strange sightings near the tree line. At dusk, tall, pale figures could be seen standing completely still among the trees, watching, their faces hidden in shadow. When anyone approached, they would vanish, melting back into the woods without sound. It wasn't just the appearance of the Crows that disturbed people. It was the feeling that they were changing into something that belonged more to the forest than to mankind. Animals around their land grew restless. Dogs refused to bark in their direction, and even birds avoided nesting in the trees surrounding the property. At night, faint light would pulse through the forest, like veins glowing beneath the surface of the earth. Those who saw it claimed it came from the ground itself, not from fire or lanterns, but from the soil, as if the mountain were alive and breathing. Over time, stories spread that the Crow family no longer buried their dead in graves, but returned them to the mountain in a ritual known only to them. Old loggers claimed to have heard chanting echoing from within caves miles from the homestead, low, rhythmic tones that seemed to come from multiple voices layered atop one another. Some believed these were burial songs. Others thought the Crows were performing something far older, ceremonies meant to feed the same force Elias had once bargained with. Whatever it was, the forest seemed to grow thicker, darker, and harder to navigate every year, as though nature itself was conspiring to keep outsiders away. Travelers who attempted to cross that part of the mountain often reported losing their sense of direction or feeling a strange pressure in their heads, as if the forest was trying to push them out. By the second decade of the 1900s, the Crow family's transformation was undeniable. A doctor from a nearby town, intrigued by rumors of a reclusive clan with bizarre physical traits, tried to pay them a visit. He never returned. Weeks later, his horse was found wandering near the base of the mountain, but the doctor's bag and his notebook were discovered half buried in mud near a stream. The last entry, scrawled in haste, read only, "They are not sick, they are evolving." The handwriting ended abruptly, smudged by rain or blood. When the doctor's family pressed for an investigation, local authorities refused, citing the mountain's treacherous terrain and unpredictable weather. Unofficially, they feared what they might find. A few brave or foolish souls still tried to approach. One such man was a traveling photographer named William Pike, who believed he could capture proof of the legendary Crow family and sell it to newspapers. He camped near the forest edge for 3 days, waiting for any sign of movement. On the 4th night, he wrote in his journal that he had seen figures dancing by a bonfire deep within the trees, their limbs long and skeletal, moving in perfect rhythm. The next entry was a frantic scribble. "They saw me. I swear they saw me." His camera was found days later, the film inside exposed to pure white, as if it had been burned from the inside out. William Pike was never seen again. The locals, now terrified, began calling the Crows the Pale Folk, or the Mountain's Blood. Some said they were cursed for their sins. Others whispered they were blessed, chosen to live forever as servants of the earth's hidden spirit. But whatever they had become, one truth remained constant. No one who crossed their land ever returned unchanged. Even those who managed to leave reported weeks of nightmares filled with distorted faces, children chanting in a foreign tongue, and the feeling of cold hands gripping their throats in the dark. The townsfolk stopped trying to rationalize it. They locked their doors during harvest season, hung charms over their windows, and told their children never to wander too close to the mountain. Years passed, and as generations turned, the story of the Crow family became less a warning and more a legend, something to frighten children or keep travelers cautious. But those who still lived near the old valley swore the family never died out. On fog-heavy nights when the moon hid behind the trees, faint lights could be seen weaving through the woods, accompanied by whispers too distant to understand. Some said it was the wind. Others insisted it was the crows, still carrying out their rituals. Their bodies no longer human, their souls bound eternally to the force Elias Crow had once promised to serve. The transformation was complete. Whatever walked those woods now was not a family. It was a bloodline turned myth, a secret the mountain refused to let die. It began quietly, just one missing man, then another. The mountains had always been known to swallow people, so no one paid much attention at first. Hunters vanished during long treks, trappers never came back to collect their furs, and travelers who took the old ridge path were never seen again. Locals chalked it up to the wilderness, to the way the Ozarks could turn on you when fog rolled in and the paths became illusions. But as the disappearances grew more frequent, a darker suspicion began to creep into the minds of those who lived nearby. Every missing person had last been seen heading toward the same stretch of land, the old Crow property. No one wanted to say it aloud, but deep down, they all knew the truth. Whatever Elias Crow had brought into those woods decades ago was still there, still feeding. Those who dared to approach the property returned with stories that twisted the stomach. A pair of hunters who ventured too close claimed to have found animal carcasses scattered through the trees, foxes, deer, even stray dogs, each one arranged in patterns far too deliberate to be natural. The bodies were laid out in circles, with the skulls placed at the center and the limbs stretched outward like a compass pointing north. Some of the carcasses were skinned clean, others half decayed, but the one thing that tied them together was the smell. It wasn't just the stench of rot, it was something sweeter, heavier, like burned honey mixed with iron. The hunters said the ground around those arrangements pulsed faintly, as though the soil itself was breathing. They never went back. Soon even the bravest woodsmen refused to enter the area. The Crow homestead had become a place of whispered fear, where no birds sang and no footprints ever stayed long on the ground. The forest seemed alive with a presence that watched from behind the trees, patient and unblinking. At night, strange lights flickered among the branches, cold blue-white glows that moved too fast to be lanterns. And every so often, a low hum could be heard beneath the wind, a sound that made the skin crawl and the chest tighten, as if the mountain itself was groaning in hunger. Old-timers said it was the crow breath, a sign that the blood debt was being paid again. Then came the stories of the lost travelers who somehow found their way back, but not all of them were whole. A young man named Peter Langley staggered into town one night, half-starved, clothes torn to shreds, his eyes wide and vacant. He had gone into the woods to hunt raccoon 3 nights earlier. When they found him, he could barely speak. His throat was raw, his hands trembling violently. All he could say over and over was, "They walk without sound. They walk under the ground." When pressed, he described seeing figures emerge from beneath the earth, their faces covered in dirt, their limbs twisting like vines. He claimed he heard children laughing from inside the mountain, and that something whispered his name from the darkness. Peter was sent to a sanatorium shortly after. He never recovered, spending the rest of his life muttering about the pale ones and the dead in the soil. By the 1920s, even law enforcement couldn't ignore what was happening. Reports of missing persons, strange animal deaths, and bizarre lights in the forest filled the sheriff's desk. Finally, a small group of deputies gathered enough courage to ride out to the Crow land. They reached the property just before sunset, their horses uneasy and refusing to go further. The forest was unnaturally quiet, every sound swallowed by the thick air. When they reached the old homestead, the place was empty, but the ground was covered in footprints, hundreds of them, some human, some too large to belong to any known creature. They found a well behind the cabin, sealed with a rusted iron lid. One of the deputies pried it open despite the others' warnings. The smell that came out was unbearable, like rotting meat and sulfur. When they shined their lanterns inside, they saw what looked like human bones, tangled in roots, the skulls still slick with moisture. Before they could investigate further, the wind changed. It was sharp and cold, carrying a faint whisper that none of them could explain. One of the deputies dropped his lantern, and the light flickered across something carved into the wall beside the well. A single word scratched deep into the wood. Offered. Panic spread through the group, and they fled without looking back. By morning, one of the deputies who opened the well fell violently ill. His skin turned pale, and his eyes developed a milky haze, almost like the Crow family's. Within a week, he was dead. The others never spoke publicly about what they saw again. The sheriff sealed the report, and the case was forgotten. The Crow property was left to rot, swallowed by vines and mist, but no one dared to demolish it. The locals believed that disturbing the land would wake something that had been buried long ago. Some said Elias Crow's descendants still lived beneath that soil, buried not dead, but waiting, their flesh fused with the mountain that had sustained them. Others believed the Crows had long ago become part of something else, guardians or prisoners of a power older than humanity. Decades later, hikers still spoke of hearing screams in the distance that faded as soon as they called out. Photographs taken near the old Crow Ridge often developed with strange smudges, faces where no one stood, glowing eyes peering from behind trees. The locals refused to discuss it. They just said the same thing their grandparents had said before them. Don't go near the Crow's land. The mountain still remembers its debt. Even after generations, no one dared to build there. The ground was left untouched, as though the earth itself had claimed that place is sacred or cursed and would never allow it to belong to the living again. It was the summer of 1912 when a traveling merchant named Thomas Avery took a wrong turn through the winding back roads of the Ozarks and stumbled upon the Crow homestead. He was a man known for his stubbornness and greed, selling trinkets and liquor to isolated farmers across the mountains. When the locals warned him not to venture too deep into the old Crow Valley, he laughed it off, calling their stories hillbilly ghost tales. The warnings only made him more curious. The Crows, he heard, were a strange but wealthy family, and a man like Avery couldn't resist the idea of earning a few extra coins from those who rarely saw outsiders. He left town just before dusk, heading north where the path turned to mud and the trees grew so dense the sunlight barely touched the ground. By the time he realized how quiet the forest had become, it was already too late to turn back. The Crow homestead appeared like something pulled from a nightmare. The house stood crooked on uneven ground, its roof sagging under years of neglect, yet there was smoke curling from the chimney and a faint orange glow from within. The air felt heavy, thick with the smell of burning herbs and decay. Avery called out several times but got no answer. Then, the front door creaked open on its own, as if the house itself were inviting him in. Against his better judgment, he stepped inside. What he saw next would be the last thing he ever spoke of. The room was dim, lit only by the flicker of a fire that burned too brightly for its size. The walls were covered in symbols he didn't recognize, spirals, handprints, and strange markings that looked half like letters, half like scratches. Around the fireplace, children sat in a circle, their skin pale as candle wax, their eyes reflecting the firelight like mirrors. They were whispering softly, their lips moving in perfect unison, but their voices didn't sound human. It was more like a low hum that vibrated through the floor. Avery froze, unable to speak. Then he noticed something in the corner of the room, something that made his blood run cold. Before he could run, something moved in the dark behind him. The air grew colder, and a sound like breathing filled the room. The children stopped whispering all at once, their heads turning toward him in perfect synchronization. One of them smiled, a small, eerie grin that showed blackened teeth. Avery's vision blurred, and he felt a pressure in his chest as if invisible hands were pushing him toward the fire. He stumbled backward, crashing into a table covered in jars. The glass shattered, spilling thick red liquid that smelled of copper and rot. Then the tall man stepped forward and whispered, "The mountain takes what it is owed." When Avery woke, he was outside, lying face down in the dirt. His horse was gone, his wagon overturned. His hands and shirt were stained with dried blood, though he had no wounds of his own. He didn't remember how he got out, or how long he had been unconscious. The forest around him was dead silent. No birds, no insects, just the low, steady hum he had heard inside the house, pulsing beneath the ground like a heartbeat. He ran for hours before finally reaching the next town, wild-eyed and shaking. When he burst into the tavern to tell his story, the crowd went silent. He described the house, the symbols, the children, and the man with the hollow eyes. But the strangest part came at the end. Avery claimed that as he fled, he looked back only once. The Crow House was burning, flames licking through the windows, yet through the smoke, he saw figures walking calmly from the fire. 5 of them, tall and pale, carrying bundles in their arms. He swore they were carrying infants, wrapped in burlap, and that the babies were crying, not in fear, but in rhythm, the same chant he had heard from the children by the fire. The sheriff investigated the area a week later but found nothing. No house, no ashes, no sign that anyone had lived there in years. The forest had reclaimed everything. Avery left the Ozarks soon after and never returned. But those who heard his story said he was never the same. He spoke of the children in his sleep, of their eyes glowing in the dark, and their voices calling his name. His hands trembled constantly, and he refused to go near fire for the rest of his life. Before he died, he told a priest that he could still hear the humming in his bones, and that he dreamed of being pulled underground by pale hands. The priest dismissed it as madness, but locals knew better. They said Avery hadn't escaped the crows at all, that whatever walked out of that burning house had followed him, and that the mountain doesn't let its debts go unpaid. Even now, travelers who wander too close to the old ridge speak of hearing faint crying carried on the wind, and of seeing smoke rise briefly from the trees before vanishing into the night, as though the fire had never stopped burning. Years after the last crow had supposedly perished, whispers began again in the nearby Ozark villages. Hunters spoke of seeing strange fires deep in the woods, flickering in the distance like ghostly lanterns. Livestock vanished without a trace, and families claimed to hear chanting at night, carried through the mist from somewhere up the ridge. The old folks said it was the crows returning to finish their bargain, a deal that had never truly ended. For generations their legend had haunted the land, and while most dismissed it as folklore, those who lived closest to the mountain swore that something still lingered there, something that was not quite human anymore. In 1928, a young man named Ellis Porter decided to uncover the truth. He was a reporter from St. Louis, known for chasing sensational stories. When he heard the locals speak of an inbred clan that had traded their children for eternal victories, he saw it as nothing more than an old superstition, until he arrived in the valley himself. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Even the wind seemed to die when he crossed the tree line. The deeper he went, the heavier the air became, and though it was early autumn, the forest felt cold enough to bite through his coat. He came across the remnants of a farmhouse, half buried beneath vines and earth. The door was gone, and inside the walls were carved with marks that looked both deliberate and desperate. Ellis set up his camp a few yards away and began to sketch the carvings. As night fell, a deep fog rolled in, smothering the moonlight. That's when he heard the first sound, soft footsteps circling his tent. He called out, thinking it might be an animal, but the steps stopped instantly, followed by a faint laugh, childlike yet hollow. He grabbed his lantern and stepped outside. Nothing. Only the fog and the whispering of leaves, though no wind moved them. He turned back toward his tent and froze. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure watching him. It was small, hunched, with limbs too long for its body and eyes that reflected the lantern's flame like wet glass. It tilted its head, studying him, before vanishing into the mist with a sudden jerking movement that made his stomach twist. The next morning, Ellis searched for tracks but found none. The ground was untouched, as though the figure had never been there. He told himself it was exhaustion or imagination, yet when he tried to leave the clearing, he couldn't find the trail he had used to arrive. The forest seemed to shift around him. By noon, he stumbled upon a narrow creek that ran red, not with blood, but with rust or mineral, he hoped. On the opposite bank lay bones, small and clean, arranged in circles. He recognized them as animal bones, until he noticed one too large to belong to any creature of the forest. A human femur, cracked at the center. By sunset, Ellis stopped hearing birds altogether. The air buzzed faintly, like a low hum just at the edge of hearing. He followed it to the remains of an old cellar entrance hidden beneath moss and branches. Against reason, he went inside. The stench hit him first, damp earth, rot, and something faintly metallic. His lantern's flame flickered as if gasping for air. Inside the cellar were old jars filled with what looked like preserved tissue and crude dolls made from hair and sticks. But what froze him in place were the symbols on the wall. They matched those he'd seen earlier, but now painted in what could only be dried blood. At the center, written large enough to cover the entire wall, were 4 words: "The mountain keeps its own." When Ellis finally stumbled out into the night, his face pale and his notebook clutched to his chest, he found that the fog had thickened so much that he could barely see his own hands. He started running, no longer caring about direction. Behind him, faint voices began to echo through the trees, children singing an old hymn out of tune. Then he saw lights, dozens of them, swaying between the trees like lanterns. But as they grew closer, he realized they weren't flames at all. They were eyes, dozens of them glowing faintly in the dark. Days later, a search party found his tent, his lantern, and his scattered notes, but no trace of Ellis himself. His last journal entry read, "They never died. The fire doesn't burn out here. It feeds." The sheriff sealed off the area soon after, though no law could keep the curious away. Over the years, others who ventured there told of seeing shapes in the fog, hearing children's laughter, and finding strange symbols burned into the trees overnight. Locals said the Crow bloodline never really vanished. It simply changed, spreading into the soil, into the air, into anyone foolish enough to go searching for them. They said the mountain remembers, and it takes back what it's owed, one by one. Years after Ellis Porter's disappearance, the Ozark town nearest to the Crow family's ruins began to wither into silence. The people still living there avoided the mountain, refusing to even speak its name after dusk. Those who dared to whisper about it claimed the land itself was cursed, that the air carried something unnatural, something that seeped into your bones if you stayed too long. The Crow bloodline, many believed, hadn't ended with the fire. It had simply gone underground, both literally and within the people who once lived near them. Some families bore strange deformities, generations later, children born with pale eyes and webbed fingers, or voices that echoed in unsettling tones. Doctors called it coincidence. The locals called it inheritance. By 1954, rumors grew of a new generation living deep within the woods, descendants of those who had escaped the fire decades earlier. The locals called them the Rootborn, because they supposedly never left the mountain and lived entirely beneath the soil, in tunnels carved from the old mining shafts the Crows once used for their rituals. At first, the stories were dismissed as mountain folklore, but then hikers began to vanish. Animals were found mutilated, their organs removed and placed in strange circular patterns. Search parties would follow the trails of blood only to find them abruptly stop at the foot of the ridge, as if the victims had been swallowed by the earth itself. A retired sheriff named Tom Hale, who had investigated the Ellis Porter case as a young deputy, became obsessed with finding proof of what he called the living crow curse. He spent years collecting accounts from locals, sightings of pale figures watching from tree lines, children with matching burn scars appearing in town only to vanish again, and strange howls that sounded almost human. Tom's investigation eventually led him to an abandoned church hidden deep in the woods, its steeple collapsed and altar blackened with age. Inside, he found relics, melted wax, bone fragments, and names etched into the pews, including that of Ellis Porter. But what disturbed him most was the discovery of fresh footprints, bare, small, and leading toward a trapdoor beneath the altar. He followed them, crawling into the narrow passage, lit faintly by dripping candles that seemed freshly burned. The deeper he went, the louder the whispering became, hundreds of voices murmuring in unison, like a prayer. The tunnel opened into a chamber, its walls covered with markings that looked almost alive under the flickering light. And there, standing in the center, was a group of figures, their faces hidden behind masks made of animal skin, Tom described them as neither male nor female, but something in between, pale, elongated, and eerily still. At their feet lay jars filled with blood and what appeared to be human teeth arranged in spirals. Before he could react, one of them turned toward him and said, in a voice that seemed to echo from every direction, "We never died. We became the earth." Tom fled and later recounted the story to the authorities, though no one believed him. When they returned to the site, the church was gone. Nothing but trees and untouched soil. He died a few years later, still muttering that the crows were alive underneath. Locals began reporting tremors in the ground after heavy rain, as if something was moving below. Some claimed to see faces pressing against the dirt at night, whispering in a language no one recognized. Others said they found symbols carved into their barn doors after dreaming of children laughing in the dark. Over time, the crow legend twisted into something more than a tale of inbreeding. It became a story of a bloodline that refused extinction, merging with the land itself. The Ozarks no longer felt like a mountain range but a living, breathing graveyard, and every time the ground trembled, the old ones said it was the root-born stirring, waiting for another generation to pull beneath the soil. By the 1980s, the legend of the Crow family had become nothing more than a whispered story told to scare outsiders. Locals insisted the bloodline was gone, that whatever evil once lived in those hills had burned away with the old homestead nearly a century earlier. But that illusion shattered when a pair of spelunkers exploring a hidden cave network stumbled upon something they couldn't explain. Deep within a limestone cavern, they found carvings, hundreds of them, depicting human figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes, all bowing toward a central symbol resembling the Crow family's old mark. Nearby were sealed jars filled with what appeared to be preserved organs, wrapped in animal hide and tied with braided human hair. Authorities dismissed it as a hoax, but when one of the spelunkers went missing weeks later, the case was quietly closed, and the other refused to ever speak about what they'd seen again. Not long after, a geologist surveying the same area reported hearing sounds coming from beneath the ground, dull, rhythmic thumps, like heartbeats. His equipment malfunctioned repeatedly, and the recordings he took that night were corrupted by a low-frequency hum, almost like a voice whispering from inside the static. He described the noise as alive. Within months, entire sections of the forest were sealed off for environmental research, though no one ever saw any scientists enter. Rumors spread that something had been uncovered, perhaps one of the tunnels Tom Hale spoke of, or worse, something still moving within them. Locals living nearby began complaining of nightmares, all describing the same vision. Pale children with blackened eyes standing outside their homes, whispering in unison, "We remember." Decades later, when a group of paranormal investigators tried to document the phenomenon, they found more than they expected. Drone footage revealed strange circular impressions in the ground, perfectly symmetrical and appearing overnight. Wildlife cameras caught brief glimpses of movement, shapes crawling just beneath the topsoil, human-like but distorted, their faces pressed against the dirt as if trying to breathe through it. The team fled before finishing their investigation, claiming the air itself grew heavy, filled with a metallic taste and faint whispering that surrounded them from every direction. When they reviewed the audio later, one sentence could be clearly heard beneath the static: "The trade was never broken." Today, that part of the Ozarks remains fenced off, marked as private land with no official owner. Locals call it the Red Hollow, and no one dares to enter after dark. Strange lights still flicker between the trees, and travelers passing through report hearing distant cries that echo for miles before fading into silence. The soil there is said to be unusually warm, even during the coldest months, as though something beneath it is still alive, still waiting. Some say the Crow family got exactly what they bargained for: eternal victories, but at the cost of their humanity. And maybe, just maybe, the price is still being collected. If you ever find yourself in those mountains, and the wind suddenly goes silent, don't look down. Because some bloodlines don't die, they just hide beneath the earth, waiting for the next name to be written into the Pact. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this.